But so the town turns automatic to warple. Send the sign or in I crane.
In January 1962, 3 girls started laughing at a mission school in Tanganyika. By the time it stopped, 2.5 years later, the event had infected roughly 1,000 people across 2 countries, forced the closure of 14 schools, and spawned an entire genre of popular mythology about contagious joy. The problem? They weren't laughing at anything. They were suffering. Every account of what happened in Bukoba tells you it was funny, delightful even. Whole villages laughing together, teachers joining in, merriment. What the archives actually say is persecution complexes, crying episodes lasting 16 days, general restlessness, symptoms that only looked like laughter because that's what the word in the original report happened to be. The laughter had nothing to do with humor. And the reason this matters, the reason we're talking about it now, is that we keep getting mass illness wrong, we keep making it mean what we want it to mean, and we keep missing the actual pattern underneath. So the question we're going to spend the next hour answering is this. If the actual illness in Tanganyika had nothing to do with laughter, nothing to do with contagion, and the way we think about contagion, what was it actually responding to? What were those girls, and the women who came after them, actually trying to escape? The original account comes from 2 people, Rankin and Philip. Their report was published in 1963, a year after the event itself, in the East African Medical Journal. They were there. Rankin was a physician at or near the school in Bukoba. Philip was a colleague. They documented what they saw. 3 girls on January 30th, 1962, then 95 of 159 students by mid-March. Then the school closed. Then it reopened. Then it spread to villages, to other schools, to Uganda. The 2 of them did what epidemiologists do. They collected data, ruled out organic causes, tested for food poisoning, looked for viruses. They found nothing. And then they made a single observation that would be almost entirely erased from every account that came after. It is suggested that this is mass hysteria in a susceptible population. This is probably a culturally determined disease. That last sentence matters. Culturally determined. Not universal, not a virus, not a joke that got out of hand. A disease shaped by where it happened and who it happened to. But here's where it gets interesting. After Rankin and Philip published, the event became famous. It stayed famous, which means a lot of people read about it without reading what they actually wrote. In 1992, a neuroscientist named Robert Provine wrote about the Tanganyika laughter epidemic in the context of his research on contagious laughter, the way laughter can spread in a group, the mechanics of it, the social bonding function. His work was legitimate, but it reframed the event as evidence of laughter's contagious power, not hysteria, laughter, and that frame stuck. By 2000, when Provine published his book on the subject, the Tanganyika case had become the canonical example of laughter being too much of a good thing. Journalists picked it up. Self-help writers picked it up. The story was too good. Whole countries laughing themselves into disability. The problem is that this narrative, the one that became famous, the one that's still in circulation, is almost entirely wrong. That's where our second set of sources comes in. Christian Hempelman, a humor researcher, published a reassessment in 2007. His job was forensic. Go back to what Rankin and Philip actually documented, compare it to what people claimed happened, figure out where the story broke. And then, in 2013, a team of researchers in Bangladesh, Binoy Krishna Tarafter, Sheikh Abdullah Al-Mahmoud, and others, encountered a mass psychogenic illness outbreak of their own. 93 teenage girls, a contaminated cake, symptoms that spread faster than any virus could account for. They had the advantage that Rankin and Philip didn't: modern psychology, a mature understanding of mass psychogenic illness as a distinct phenomenon, and the ability to document it in real time. What they found matched Hempelman's analysis perfectly, which means we're not talking about one bizarre colonial-era anomaly. We're talking about a pattern, a reproducible pattern, which raises a question nobody was asking. What if mass psychogenic illness isn't rare at all? What if it's just invisible unless you're looking for it? And what does that tell us about stress, about power, about who gets to express distress in a way that's socially acceptable? Start with what Rankin and Philip actually documented. The original report states, the disease commenced on the 30th of January 1962 at a mission-run girls' school at Kashasha village, 25 miles from Bukoba, when 3 pupils commenced to act in an abnormal manner. Then, From that date until the 18th of March 1962, when the school was forced to close down, 95 of the 159 pupils had been affected. The key phrase is buried in their description of the symptoms themselves. Attacks of laughing and crying lasting for a few hours, in a few cases up to a maximum of 16 days, with an average of 7 days, followed by a respite and then a recurrence in the majority of cases. General restlessness, persecution complex. Persecution complex, not joy, not merriment, persecution complex. That detail doesn't make it into the popular accounts. It should have. It's the entire diagnosis. Now jump forward to 1992. Robert Provine, in his work on laughter, describes the event like this. The power of contagious laughter as a social coupling process is suggested by a persistent epidemic of laughter that began among 12 to 18-year-old girls in a boarding school in Tanganyika and spread throughout a district, requiring the closing of schools. Social coupling, the joyful spreading of happiness through physical proximity. That's what he's arguing the Tanganyika case demonstrates. Except Hempelman, 40 years after the original event, and in his 2007 reassessment, points out something Provine seems to have missed entirely. The laughter was not the cause of the epidemic. It was a symptom of it, and not even the primary symptom. It is argued that the event is a motor variant case of mass psychogenic illness, of which laughter is one common symptom. Therefore, it cannot serve as support for other arguments in humor research. Let me be clear about what that means. The phenomenon that Provine built an entire argument around, the contagiousness of laughter, may not have been contagious at all. The contagiousness was psychological distress, expressing itself through motor behavior. The laughter was incidental. But here's what makes the Bangladesh case in 2013 so important. It gives us a direct comparison. Tarevter and his team document an almost identical scenario 50 years later and half a world away. On the 14th of April 2013, a total of 93 students of a girls' high school suddenly developed various symptoms following intake of tiffin cake, which resulted in panic and hospital admission. The symptoms they recorded, commonest symptoms were abdominal pain, 83%, headache, 73%, body ache, 63%, nausea, 69%, and generalized weakness and fatigue, 61%. Notice what's missing from that list. Laughter doesn't appear as a symptom at all in the Bangladesh outbreak. What does appear instead? This, crying and shouting, in 16.1% of cases, pseudo-seizure in 7.5%, motor symptoms, physical expressions of distress, different culture, different symptom profile but the same underlying mechanics, which means the laughter in Tanganyika wasn't culturally universal. It was culturally specific. The girls were expressing distress through the motor symptoms their culture had a script for. The question then becomes, what were they responding to? Rankin and Phillip had an observation about that too. They note the timing. It appears likely that these political events, less than 2 months from the outbreak of the Bukoba event on January 30th, 1962, and, in addition, the abandonment of racial division in schools since January 1st, 1962, increased the sociocultural stress situation in the young country in general. Tanganyika had just achieved independence. December 9th, 1961, that's when they became a nation. 3 weeks later, the school integration order. 7 weeks later, the outbreak. Hempelman expands on this. A combination of these factors creates a stress-inducing context that is the indirect cause of the epidemic event described by Rankin and Phillip. But I argue that which of these factors is more important, and which may not even pertain, and which may have been overlooked, especially at the individual and prodromal group level, can no longer be clearly decided for the Bukoba event. What he's saying is, we know it was stress. We know it was cultural transition. We know the girls were separated from their families, adolescent, confronted with Western educational standards in a post-colonial institution. But we don't know exactly which pressure broke them. The Bangladesh team adds another layer. They document this. All students reported exam ahead within 1 month, and 84% of ill students came to school without taking breakfast. Academic pressure, physical vulnerability, a trigger, the cake, which 98% of students consumed, and 88% reported noticing an abnormal smell or taste or both in. But here's the crucial detail. The result of sample of cake sent for microbiological examination did not prove any association with toxic or infectious agent. Also, teachers and other students who took the same cake at the same time did not experience any abnormal symptom. The cake wasn't poisoned. The cake was a story they were primed to believe. The cake was permission to get sick. And Tarevter documents the mechanism. Contagion is increased by being close to affected and unaffected persons, reassembly of the group such as being put in the same ward in a hospital, and line of sight transmission. The spread pattern was psychological. Visual proximity to illness spread illness. Once 93 girls were in a hospital together, the symptom pool expanded. Some students didn't recover, and relapse of the attack needing readmission was present in 18% of students. The illness wasn't finished. It was interrupted. But there's one more piece that ties this together. Hempelman cites research on what he calls the sick role advantage. The argument is this: in cultures where certain symptoms are socially acceptable and others are not, people under unbearable stress will express their distress through the symptoms their culture permits. He quotes one source: "I enjoyed the attention this malady afforded and the general concern of everyone around me. I used it as an escape from the problems I could not face at home and at school and became completely wrapped up in it." That's from an index case in a 1973 London school outbreak. The person wasn't consciously faking. They were using the only socially acceptable route out of an impossible situation. Hempelman writes, "Under these circumstances, MPI can afford its victims the advantages of the sick role." It must be cautioned again that the rationalization presented in this section is the most speculative part of the present discussion. He's being careful. He's saying, we can document the pattern, but the individual motivation is hidden. We can see that the girls got sick and got hospitalized and got removed from school and got attention. We can't see into the decision-making of the body. We can only see the result. A system that couldn't tolerate their distress found a language it could tolerate. Physical symptom, medical emergency, temporary closure, and the girls spoke in that language. Here's what the sources reveal. Mass psychogenic illness is not rare. It is not exceptional. It is a predictable response to unbearable stress in populations, with no legitimate means of expressing that stress. The archives don't have an opinion. They just have a date. January 30th, 1962. April 14th, 2013. 50 years, 2 continents, 2 nearly identical outbreaks of the same phenomenon. And between them, Hempelman's 2007 reassessment showing that the mechanism had been documented and redocumented for over a century, in schools, in factories, in communities undergoing cultural transition. The girls in Tanganyika weren't uniquely vulnerable. They were trapped. Separated from family, adolescent, confronted with colonial educational standards in a post-colonial state that was still defining itself. The girls in Bangladesh weren't uniquely sensitive. They were pressured, facing exams, coming to school hungry, primed by institutional anxiety. Both groups found that their distress, the legitimate distress of people in impossible situations, had no acceptable outlet, so their bodies spoke, motor symptoms. Laughter and crying, abdominal pain, seizure-like episodes. The body saying what the mouth couldn't, "I cannot continue like this." But there's an objection worth taking seriously. You could argue that this analysis mistakes correlation for causation. Yes, both outbreaks happened during times of stress. Yes, both involved young women in institutional settings. But that doesn't mean the stress caused the illness. Stress is everywhere. Most stressed people don't develop mass psychogenic symptoms. So why these girls? Why then? The objection has merit. It's the question Hempelman himself flags when he says we can no longer clearly decide which factors mattered in the Bukoba case. We have the timeline. We have the context. We don't have the interior lives. We don't have access to the precise moment when individual distress became collective symptom. The skeptic would say, you're constructing a narrative that fits the data, not reading data that proves the narrative. You're doing what Provine did with laughter, taking one symptom and making it the story. But here's where that objection falls apart. The Trafter team didn't just document one outbreak. They documented the spreading pattern. They showed that symptoms moved through, line of sight, transmission, that hospitalization accelerated it, that media coverage amplified it. That's not correlation. That's mechanism. And they showed something else crucial. When the symptoms appeared, no organic cause was found. The cake wasn't poisoned. The air wasn't contaminated. There was no pathogen. The only thing that spread was the story that people had been exposed to danger. The only contagion was the permission to be sick. The vocabulary changes when the liability shifts. When Rankin and Phillip were trying to rule out organic causes in 1962, they were thinking like epidemiologists. When Tarafter's team tested the cake in 2013, they were thinking the same way. But the moment the tests came back negative, the moment they confirmed there was no infectious agent, the framework should have shifted. And it did in the medical literature. But not in the popular imagination. Provine's version of the Tanganyika story is still more famous than Hempelman's. The girl who laughed is still more memorable than the girl with a persecution complex. We prefer the narrative of joy spreading to the narrative of distress finding its only available language. What this actually means is darker than it sounds. It means that when a system is structured such that certain people have no legitimate way to express distress, their bodies will find an illegitimate one. And when those bodies speak, the system has an interesting choice. It can address the distress, or it can address the symptom. In 1962, in Tanganyika, the authorities closed the school. In 2013, in Bangladesh, the authorities hospitalized the girls. Both responses are predictable. Both are humane in their way. But neither one asks the question underneath. Why were these girls in a position where illness was their only escape route? The school was closed, yes, but what changed when it reopened? The girls relapsed. They got sick again. The Bangladesh team documents this. 18% of students needed readmission. You don't get readmission relapse from a viral infection. You get it from an unresolved stressor. The structure that broke them was still there. The system that made them sick had only temporarily paused. And if you understand mass psychogenic illness as what it actually is, a communication from the powerless to the powerful, then the relapse becomes a message. We are still trapped. Your solution was not a solution. It was an interruption. Which brings us to the final point. The reason this matters now is that we are not finished with the conditions that create mass psychogenic illness. If anything, we're accelerating them. Adolescents facing academic pressure, women in low-status positions, populations undergoing rapid social transition, environments where institutional anxiety is amplified by media and social networks, instead of contained by them. The third source, the research on social media and psychiatric disorders, documents this explicitly. The likelihood of anxiety disorders is directly proportional to time spent on social networks, frequency of usage, and number of platforms. The mechanism isn't mysterious. Unhealthy comparisons, social burnout, lack of emotional regulation, decreased real-life social interactions. And here's the part that connects directly to what we're seeing. Pre-existing anxiety can induce social media addiction, which can, in turn, cause more anxiety. It's a feedback loop. Stress creates the search for connection. Connection amplifies the perception of threat. Threat increases stress. In a system like that, the body doesn't just speak. It screams. And we're building bigger institutions, more competitive environments, more ways to quantify and broadcast failure, fewer legitimate exits, and calling it normal. The archives don't have an opinion. They just have a pattern. And the pattern says, we know how this ends. Here's what you should understand. Mass psychogenic illness is not a quirk of history, or a curiosity of colonial medicine, or a story about girls who laugh too much. It is a systemic indicator. It is what happens when a population, under severe stress, has no legitimate avenue for expressing that stress. The body becomes the message. And because bodies are undeniable in a way that complaints are not, illness forces attention in a way that words cannot. The girls in Tanganyika were not crazy. They were not faking. They were not contagiously laughing at nothing. They were trapped in a post-colonial institution during the most volatile moment of their country's existence, separated from their families, confronted daily with the standards of the colonizers, and told to sit still and learn. Their bodies said no. The girls in Bangladesh were not poisoned. They were not suffering from a mystery virus. They were facing exams they couldn't afford to fail, coming to school without breakfast, in a system that measured their worth in test scores. When permission to be sick arrived, when the cake became the story, their bodies said yes. This is not metaphorical. This is not poetic. This is literal physiology, severe psychological stress expressing itself through motor symptoms, because motor symptoms are socially acceptable, where psychological complaints are not. And here is what that means for you. If you are in a system that does not permit you to say, I cannot, your body will say it for you. If you are trapped, if you are pressured, if the cost of honesty is too high, the body finds another language. It always does. The second thing you should understand is that this is invisible until you look for it. Provine's interpretation of the Tanganyika epidemic dominated for 40 years because it was a better story than Rankin and Phillips' diagnosis. Contagious laughter is memorable. Culturally determined mass psychogenic illness is not. We prefer to believe that joy spreads more easily than distress, that laughter is more powerful than pain, that happiness is the default and sadness the aberration. And so we tell the story we want to hear instead of reading the document we have. The same thing is happening now with social media-induced mental health disorders. We call it addiction, we call it preference, we call it a choice. But the research is clear. It's a symptom. It's what happens when anxiety drives the search for connection, and connection amplifies the anxiety, and the system keeps you scrolling because your distress is profitable. The vocabulary changes when the liability shifts. We don't say trapped, we say engaged. We don't say symptomatic, we say active. We don't say the system is breaking them, we say they're struggling with balance. And because we refuse to see the pattern, we keep missing the intervention point. The body is screaming. We keep offering it metrics instead of exit routes. But here's what the sources cannot tell us. How do you build a system that permits distress to be spoken instead of symptomatic? How do you create institutions, schools, workplaces, communities, where people under stress have legitimate ways to exit, to rest, to say no without consequence? The Tanganyika school closed. The Bangladesh girls were hospitalized. Both responses halted the outbreak. Neither one changed the conditions that created it. When the schools reopened, the girls got sick again. The stress was still there. The trap was still there. The only thing that changed was the temporary absence of the trigger and the temporary presence of attention. And we don't have a source that documents what happens next. We don't have a case study of an institution that identified the underlying stress, that restructured itself to permit legitimate expression of distress, that followed the girls forward and confirmed they never relapsed. We have evidence of the problem. We don't have evidence of the solution. The blueprint is public. You just have to read it without blinking. But the blueprint only tells you what's broken. It doesn't tell you how to fix it. And that absence, that missing piece in the archive, might be the most important thing to notice.